I'm about to start. All right, if you are attending right now, it looks like we're up to about 38 people checked in and are online. If you could, I'm not sure what your screen looks like, but you should see a control for a hand. Okay, yeah, there we go. All right, I see Casey, Marianne, Forrest. If you could hit that hand for me, just let me know that you're hearing me. All right. Woohoo! Good job, guys. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We're going to be a real light start off here so that people coming in a little later won't miss anything. I appreciate every one of you joining. We're getting up to 49 people on the webinar. This is pretty awesome for an inaugural kickoff of this new format of training. We're definitely using this for a training ground to jump into other things that we want to do. So with that said, I want to welcome everyone to week 1 of the CPN Technician Class License webinar. If you look in your toolbar where you saw the hand, you will see a little piece of paper with the corner bent over. If you click on that, you'll see share a file. I'm only going by what I see on my screen, so I hope it's the same for you. And if you click on the ellipsis to the far right of that, you'll see 3 files that I've attached. The technician test question pool, you're welcome to click on any of these and download them. And I'll be pulling directly from this question pool tonight. And the format that we'll be using is we're going to go ahead and we are going to go through each question. And as we go through the questions, we're going to go through each of the answers and why they can't be the answer. I know so many of you want to actually learn ham radio. And I have to tell you that a majority of the learning really does come once you have the radio in hand. It can actually key up and use it. That's where you learn. It's just like when you got your driver's license. I think everybody remembers the first time you got on the highway with a new driver's license. It's kind of the same way. So what the question pool enables you to do is just get a background on the fundamentals to get you started, so that you just don't key up and don't know where to go. So with that said, well, I still have people wanting to join the webinar and find out about it. So we'll go ahead and get started here. So let's talk about the test for a minute. The test is going to be 35 multiple choice questions. You only have to answer 26 of them correctly to pass. It just basically covers all the basic rules, the operating practices that your other ham radio operators that are going to be listening to you expect you to operate. And there is a little bit of electrical and electronics theory involved. But I can tell you this. There are some electronics and electrical theory that you're just going to have to remember. You're going to have to find your own way to remember it. And if you can think of a way to remember it, email me so I can improve as an instructor. But some of these you're never going to see them again. When you're operating your radio, you're not worried about diodes, transistors, capacitors, and looking at blueprints. But if that radio ever breaks, it certainly helps if you know what each schematic symbol means. So that's why they kind of include that. I will say that you can miss every math question that they offer on the test, every single one, and you'll still pass the test. Typically, you can miss 9 questions. There's usually about 6 math questions. So it still gives you a few that you can miss. But I would say that if you're going to be weak in the math, you really need to be strong on all the other concepts. I will say that knowing Morse code is no longer required. I think that really opened up ham radio as a hobby. Of course, some of your purists cringe at the idea, and their eyes are bleeding because they believe that you should know Morse code. And you've got purists out there who believe you should know how to repair your radio too. But nevertheless, they've made it a lot easier now that you don't need to know Morse code. The test usually costs about $15. Sometimes it can be a little less, but the rules state that it cannot be no more than $15. If you pass the test, let me rewind for a second. The test has to be proctored by 3 volunteer examiners. There's a lot of paperwork that goes into you taking the test, and that $15 goes for the administrative costs, mailing, and materials, the paper that your test is printed on, all that stuff. It goes towards that. But 3 volunteer examiners have to give that exam, and they have to give it in person. The 3 examiners to give a technician test, they have to be a general class or higher. If they're going to give the general test, you have to have a minimum of 3 volunteer examiners that are extra class. And primarily that goes to, they don't want the volunteer examiners having so much exposure to a test, to a licensed class that they don't have yet, and get an unfair advantage to getting the next level license. So, but if you fail the test, you can retake it the same day. You just pay the same testing fee, you pay it again. The running joke is bring $45. That way you got 3 chances. If you don't get it in 3, you might want to take a break and step back. But most people, sometimes they don't get it right the first time, and it's usually they walk into the room, they've got jitters, and once they take the first one and they've gone through a series of questions, they find themselves, what we find is their body language shows that they are a lot more relaxed, and their mind has gotten into the test mode. So not too many tests that you take anymore, you can take it the exact same day, but with the FCC test, you can. However, if you pass the test, you're usually offered to be able to take the general class for free. And I always encourage people to take the general class license test. Even if you don't know the questions on it, I have found, I've even had friends that took it and actually passed it and totally shocked themselves. I've had people that have taken it and got a better score than they thought they could have ever imagined that they would. And that in itself gives them the confidence that, hey, you know what, I can pass the general test. But if it does anything, it affords you the ability to get insight into the next test before you ever start studying for it. So when you start studying for it, you tend to be a little bit more confident in going in to take that test. Right now, you haven't never taken an FCC test. You really don't know what to expect on the test. Some of you that are attending this webinar already have your technician license, so you can relate to some of these things that I'm saying. But we totally understand that you don't know the type of test you're getting into. You don't know what you're going to see. You know, and that's just, why not eliminate that possibility, that feeling again when you come back around to take the general test? So it always helps to, you know, just take it if it's free. I will say you can bring a calculator to the exam. I'm going to show you some ways that you can pass this test without a calculator. I never used a calculator in any 3 of my tests. I am an extra class. I'll take that back. I did use it a little bit on my extra exam when it came to theory, but I really found that the calculator wasn't of any use to me personally. Other people it is. So if you have any questions while we are, see, I'm take a second here. I'm going to read. Let's see. Don't see. Okay, you can't see the hand you mentioned, but can hear just fine. I'm going to go ahead and make our chat public. That way, maybe you guys can help each other out throughout the class. If somebody sees it and somebody else doesn't, it would help me not having to stop the class. I was making it private because I didn't want anybody to feel embarrassed by asking questions, but you know, this is a team effort. We're all in this together, so I've just made it public. If you have a question, go ahead and post it in chat so that we can see it. Okay, Forrest is saying there is no chat window. We can only chat with you. Okay. We'll have to excuse a little bit of the hiccups. This is our first time doing this. Okay, so Forrest says now it's open. The chat should be open now that I made it public. Awesome, awesome. Like I said, please excuse a little bit of the hiccups. It's going to be just a little bit of a rough start. We're getting off the gravel and we're getting off the main road and hitting the gravel here. It'll be a little rough for the first time, but we're quickly going to get ramped up here. So let's see. And where you see the chat, hopefully somewhere in there you see a piece of paper with the corner bent over for file sharing. Okay, we're going to keep going. I really don't want to waste too much to follow these questions verbatim, one by one by one. I've also posted the presentation as well. So, all right. So let's go ahead and we're going to go ahead and start with the questions. So the first question in the question pool is, which of the following is a purpose of the amateur radio services stated in the FCC rules and regulations? Well, we know that it can't be letter A because FCC is not concerned about numbers. They're not concerned about numbers, so we know that it's not for as many citizens as possible. And we're not really worried about the communications for international nonprofit organizations because you yourself are studying for the exam and taking the test, and you yourself are not a nonprofit organization, so you can cancel out the B. So because it can't be B, it can't be D. All answers are correct, so it has to be C. The rules also cite the use of amateur radio as a reason why people become better technicians and operators, therefore advancing the skills in the technical and communication phases of the radio is the purpose for amateur radio service. So, as you can attest by taking this class, when you're done with this class, your technical skills and understanding what a capacitor and a transistor and a diode and understanding what repeaters are and what propagation is, you're going to advance in those skills. So that should be able to help you get to memorize that answer for that question. Which agency regulates and enforces the rules for amateur radio service in the United States? I think everybody, there are going to be some questions on the test that are just gimmies. I almost feel like if you get the question wrong, you just shouldn't proceed any further. Everybody knows, I think, is pretty well aware of that anything to do with radio, whether it's FM radio, AM radio, in your car, the FCC regulates that. They regulate TV. They regulate all forms of communication. We know Homeland Security doesn't have anything to do with it, and FEMA doesn't have anything to do with it. They're too busy cleaning, running around, cleaning up after disasters. The ITU, you're not aware of what that is yet, but we'll get to that. It's an arm of the United Nations. It's a coalition of different countries that come together to agree on rules of amateur radio. So it's not ITU. You need to worry about what's a little bit lower than that. And that's what's in the United States. Since ITU has to do with the United Nations, the question is asking who enforces the rules in the United States. So FCC would be your answer. Which part of the FCC regulations contain the rules governing amateur radio service? There's not really a whole lot I can tell you how to remember that it's 97. You just have to remember it. And Part 97 is mentioned all the time, just all the time throughout ham radio. Every question that you have in this question pool are directly pulled from Part 97. The whole entire test is centered around acquainting you with Part 97. When you get into the general test, you're no longer worried about Part 97 because you've already been made aware of what it is and what it contains. You start getting into a little bit of antennas, propagation, radio parts, things like that. The technician test solely centers around procedures and policies, and that's exactly what the Part 97 does. So in essence, Part 97 defines the terms and concepts that every amateur radio operator needs to know. There is a paper copy of it, and you will be getting that through the class, through the course. The rules state that you really should have that printed out, the Part 97. There's two things that the rules say that have to be near your radio. Is you have to have Part 97 printed out or accessible. It doesn't really say printed on paper. It has to be accessible. And you have to have a copy of your license accessible. However, they stopped giving paper licenses when you earned your license, and they stopped mailing them to you. You have to specifically reach out for those. There's going to be a new question pool that will come out in July 1st of 2018. So it's really important that you get in and get your test before then. We'll finish this class way far before that. But typically, I think they're going to drop that part because they no longer issue the paper licenses. So, and I don't think they necessarily require, they just require that you be able to provide proof. So, which of the following meets the FCC definition for harmful interference? It could be letter A, radio transmissions that annoy users of a repeater. However, that's not really a harmful interference. It does hold things up, does hold up the repeater from working, but it doesn't necessarily affect everybody in an area from using the radio. They simply tune to another repeater, or they go simplex. What they're asking here is harmful interference in such a way that you can no longer, your radio is rendered useless or rendered as very difficult to use because of the interference, no matter what you do with it. unwanted radio transmissions that cause costly harm to radio station apparatus. You know, I would think that they would be referring to something like an EMP or an electrical surge, a lightning storm. You know, those are things that are acts of Mother Nature. The FCC doesn't have so much of a definition and consider lightning or acts of nature as being harmful interference. So and then D, static from lightning storms. Static from lightning storms is going to cause damage if it does anything. It doesn't necessarily cause interference. But I would say that you probably be quite a fool to use your radio in the middle of a lightning storm. So really the answer that makes sense, that covers the widest definition of harmful interference, is that which seriously degrades, obstructs, and repeatedly interrupts a radio communication service operating in accordance with the radio regulations. So John was asking, are they referring to something known as a jammer? Yes, a jammer could be considered harmful interference. A jammer is willful interference, meaning you are aware that you are interfering with radio waves. There is nothing, you are never going to get in trouble if you unknowingly are causing interference. But once you're made aware of the interference, you have an obligation to mitigate that interference and to investigate it and work with whoever reported it to you, because they would be the party to be able to tell you whether you resolve the issue. If you don't resolve interference, they can report you, and you could have the FCC come out and investigate you further. Rarely does that ever happen, but it has happened in cases where radio services have interrupted emergency services and are interfering with emergency services' ability to provide the public with vital services. All right, Helen, I got your email. I was just reading it. Sorry, Helen. So, and in my experience with ham radio, especially living out in the country, I can tell you that these are the most common forms of interference. If you go down your street, more often than not, the transformer that is on your pole is going to have worn out parts on it. The insulators, due to weather, a lot of times those transformers have been up there for many, many years and have never, weather, it being exposed to extreme cold, extreme heat, wind, moisture, it wears on the parts, especially the insulating parts that keep metal from touching metal so much. And when that happens, sometimes the metal will arc. They will arc through the insulating material. And that arc is exactly what's letting off the interference. So more often than not, the culprit is going to be on your telephone poles out on the street. And the best way to be able to tell that I've been told, is to get an AM radio, just a handheld AM radio, and walk around and tune that radio and walk around. Especially a lot of times these telephone poles, I don't know if you've ever heard it, but in some residential areas, especially residential areas that have been established for a while, you can hear the crackling and popping up at the top of the pole. It varies. Sometimes it's louder than others. Sometimes it's really loud after a storm. And then sometimes you hear it all the time, but after a storm, you don't hear it. So there's really no rhyme or reason on when it would be worse times than others. But if you go around a pole that is close to your house, it should interfere with the AM transmission of that radio. That's the way I've been told that the easiest way to be able to determine that. Especially out in the country, the other interference, and it drives me crazy, is electric fences for livestock. And what happens is that, don't know if you guys can see my mouse. You probably can't. Probably I'm just seeing it. But the electric fence that they use to keep individuals in, keep the livestock in. I mean, if you want to keep your kids in and use electric fence, then, so be it. Just don't join that family out in California we're hearing about in the news now. But what ends up happening is a lot of times these electric fences have been up for several years, and again, goes back to the telephone poles. The insulating parts wear out, and an electric company definitely has the equipment and the ability to be able to maintain the maintenance of the poles, but often they rely on us, me and you, to alert them when arcing and when worn parts and things like that. But out in the country, your farmers, they don't necessarily walk the line and walk down their fence to see if the insulators on their this is the last thing that they're worried about. The insulators are not going to keep the line from working. So the farmer's only going to realize that he has a problem when his livestock start getting out. Another thing that will cause it, besides worn out insulators, is when the grass grows up high enough that it actually touches the wire, and that will cause interference as well. And I think we often see that more than anything, because livestock, if they're getting stung, so when they get stung going near that fence, they're not going to go near that fence as much to chew the grass down. So that's where it tends to grow the highest. So these are the two places that I think we see the most. The picture in the middle is a representative of an electric company, and he has a device that he's able to use that enables him to be able to determine what the RFI, radio frequency interference, RFI, is coming off of an apparatus or off of a piece of equipment. If you call the electric company and complain that there's interference coming from a pole, they are obligated. They have to come out and investigate it, but per FCC rules, because their equipment is causing the interference, is causing willful interference. So, and most of the time, they're grateful that you're calling them, because they want to be able to come out and mitigate that issue before it becomes a bigger problem. Parts that are touching each other that aren't insulated are a greater risk of getting hit by lightning. So by you contacting them, you're just helping them reduce their maintenance costs of equipment. A transformer can be, tens of thousands of dollars. And if you're helping them keep the lightning at bay, they're definitely not going to be rude to you. So, amateur operators regularly conduct roundtable gatherings on a specific frequency called a net or a rag chew. It's what you will see, is where we're going to try to go with CPN is an organized time on a day and a time. You're going to be able to meet up on a frequency, on a repeater, and be able to talk to one another. However, if another operator repeatedly transmits on that frequency that's already been being used, that's considered harmful interference, and it's illegal. If you're on a frequency, cows are people too. If you're on a frequency and somebody was already talking, when you turn to a frequency, often it's best if you just sit there for a couple of seconds to hear if there's traffic, because oftentimes two parties aren't they're not talking back and forth. As soon as one's done, the other one picks up, and the other one picks up, and they go back and forth. It doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes there's a little gap. I could be talking to Forrest, and Forrest is on his way out to his truck, or he was in his truck. And when I'm done talking, he's getting out of the truck to go into the store and turning up his handheld. So give it a couple seconds, listen. If you don't hear anything, transmit. You're not going to get in trouble. The worst thing that would happen was somebody would come in and say, hey, buddy, we were on this frequency. Can you jump to another frequency or wait till we're done? And ham radio operators are very cooperative with each other. We have each other's call sign. We can get each other's address. And we all know that. So we are very cooperative with each other. And it's a we hope and we try to keep it a gentleman's hobby and just have courtesy for one another. You don't want your call sign to get out there among the community as being, rude and uncooperative, because what will happen is people will get back at you when you're talking and you want to have a conversation. People, turnabout is fair play. People can start keying up and locking you up. You can participate in nets. And when they hear you call in, they can key up and lock up the repeater so your transmission never gets out. So you don't want it to come back and bite you. And so which of the following is a purpose of the amateur radio service rules and regulations? More than anything, it's to further international goodwill. I mean, when you think about it as an HF operator, I don't care if I'm talking, when I'm reaching out on a station and I reach somebody in Russia, I'm excited that my radio got that far. I'm not worried about Russia collusion with Trump and what's in the news lately. It's just no concern to me. If I were talking to a station there's a guy in Iraq who, if you send him a couple of dollars to help feed his family, he will send you a QSL card, which is a postcard with his call sign on it, and he'll sign it on the back and everything and fill it out. And you're helping him, but at the same time, it used to be that we had logbooks. The way that you logged your calls, especially at HF, was you got postcards in the mail, and it stated what time, what frequency, the power you used, as all the information about the conversation you had with that person that sent you that card. And it's called a QSL card. With the digital age, we no longer really have that anymore. It's kind of a pastime. Every once in a while, people will still send you one. The older hams that are nostalgic, they still send them. And it's just really cool. It's like getting a handwritten letter. How often you get that versus an email. So the QSL cards are we're a way of enhancing international goodwill, because the idea was to collect QSL cards from the farthest corners of the world that you could. If you could get a QSL card from an island in the South Pacific that nobody's ever heard of, that was like finding a needle in a haystack. And, among ham radio operators, that was something to brag about. So, but the way that that it's enhancing goodwill. So let's go through the other answers real quick. Providing inexpensive communication for local emergency organizations. I mean, that could be true, but it's not the sole purpose of amateur radio service, because that would imply that we get into this hobby solely for emergency communications. HF is high frequency radio. You won't. We'll get into a little bit of the privileges that technician has on HF, but primarily you're going to see HF privileges in the general class license. But HF is your long distance communications. That's the kind of radio that you use the atmosphere to be able to reach on the other side of the world and talk to other countries. With a technician license, there are techniques like Earth, Moon, Earth, you have some technicians that will bounce a signal off of the moon to reach the other side of Earth. That's a really big hobby for folks. Satellite communications is another. But primarily as a technician, you're really going to be restricted to regional and local communications. Most of the time, your equipment is only going to reach, for a technician, is only going to reach maybe under 50 miles at the most. So, and that's right, Carrie and Natalie. It says, what is a purpose, not the purpose. Training of operators in military radio operating procedures. Well, then that would imply that they have a radio service called MARS, Military Auxiliary Radio Service. These guys, before we had the advent of the internet, when some of us guys were in service, you had to wait weeks to get a letter from home. And if the wife was pregnant while you were deployed, it was the American Red Cross that got to your unit to let you know that you were going to be a daddy, and sent a telegram. Oftentimes that telegram arrived through the MARS service, volunteer amateur radio operators who worked with military frequencies to get that information out. MARS still exists today. It's not nearly as popular as it was before, but the military still keeps MARS around as a service of national defense in case of our network, communications network for the military were to be hindered in any way, say like a Pearl Harbor attack or 9/11. The military understands the importance of ham radio and keeps us in their back pocket as well. However, that's not, it is one of the services, one of the purposes of amateur radio, but amateur radio is the key word here to keep the military. So the answer with military, you want to keep that out of it. And since it doesn't, D, not all the answers are correct. It can only be A, enhancing international goodwill. I mean, one of the purposes is to recognize its usefulness in emergency and public service communications. So that is a possible answer. It is possible. However, such a small number of ham radio operators participate in emergency communications. An overwhelming majority of ham radio operators use it as a hobby. And just to have a friendly additional level of communications they can have with people around them. So your better answer would be enhancing the international goodwill. Which of the following services are protected from interference by amateur signals under all circumstances? So what they're asking here is, no matter what the circumstance is, no matter what the scenario is, what service out of these is always protected, comes first, takes precedence over everybody else? Well, citizens radio service, we know in a government citizens come last. We should be the boss, but we know that's not the case. Broadcast service. Sorry, I had to get something to drink there. Broadcast service would lend to TV and radio. And as we saw on 9/11, the government can shut down those broadcasts instantly. Interestingly enough, I should add that the War Powers Act, that President Obama increased the War Powers Act. I believe it was President Obama. I could be wrong. War Powers Act's been around since the 1930s, and it's been added to over the years. And President Obama saw the need that the government needed to take control of the airwaves in case of times of national emergency, and that they were to manage the airwaves. So if he declares the War Powers Act, the president does, ham radio becomes illegal as well. However, The government knows they can't shut down ham radio. There's no way. The government also, because we're not dependent on any infrastructure, we can communicate directly with each other. And the only way they would be able to stop us is to jam the airwaves. But repeater owners can be subjected to having their repeaters taken down if a War Powers Act is enacted. So the radio navigation service is considered a safety of life service. Therefore, it gets priority over casual conversations. And radio navigation services, if you think about it, it makes sense because it includes GPS. So you can imagine in this day and time, if people's GPS cease to work. As you know, a lot of people don't think about it, but your fire departments and your police departments, they rely on GPS. They have a system in place that when you call in and the dispatcher puts in your address, it brings up the route and a picture of the front of your house for the fire department to get to. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, they don't have to look for the 1-inch high little numbers beside your door. They have a picture of what the front of your house looks like through the tax card, the county tax card. So GPS is really, really important. E-Loran is a Marine radio service and Marine VHF channels. Marine VHF, when you think about it, when you're sailing on the seas, you don't want to have to be told, please wait as your boat's sinking so that Charlie and Sam can continue their conversation about the Eagles and Patriots going to the Super Bowl. As well as aircraft landing systems. You don't want an aircraft having to stand by up in the air until Sam and John get done with their conversation before radio tower can take over and guide the plane in. As well as radio positive train control. So a lot of your rails are remotely controlled, especially at crossings and at splitters. So you could effectively see that there would be an accident there waiting to happen, a massive accident, especially chemicals and so forth. So just think about that for a second. Radio navigation service, it just makes sense. What is the FCC Part 97 definition of telemetry? So telemetry, a lot of times, I first was heard about telemetry in the medical field, but telemetry is often used in science. And by knowing that, if you know that telemetry is related to science, what does science more often do? They take measurements. So you know that telemetry isn't going to be an information bulletin issued by the FCC. That would just be a notice. A one-way transmission to initiate, modify, and terminate functions of a device at a distance, that's called telecommand. When you read B, you think of satellites. And when you think of telecommand, you think of space, NASA, aerospace industry. So B would be telecommand, and that is another question we're going to get here next. One of the next couple of questions is going to be telecommand. So an information bulletin from a VEC. VEC is Volunteer Examiner Coordinator. Your ham radio operators that have nothing to do with VEs will never see bulletins that come from VEC. It will never happen. So you can cross that one out. You're taking an exam. You're studying for a test for overall ham radio operation at a technician level. You're not concerned about bulletins that go to a finite number of operators. So one-way transmission of measurements at a distance from the measuring instrument. And the easiest way to remember telemetry would be, you could think of as wildlife. You know, when we put transmitters on endangered species and we track their movements, sharks birds and wildlife. That's telemetry. We get information back through, you see this picture of the alligator and this little antenna on the back of them. We're able to, telemetry is able to give us measurements of his mating habits, of his habits during weather and things like that. So, but primarily you can see it used, telemetry is used in weather buoys and weather instruments. That would be telemetry as well. Do we have any questions so far? I'm going to take a second. I don't want to get too far. We're about 8 questions in. We got quite a few. I want to see if we have any questions. Real quick, you can hit me on with them. Take a break so we don't go too far. I don't want to leave people too far behind. Okay. So if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat. I can see the chat room in real time, so I'll stop for a second and answer your question. So don't feel shy. I will get to your question. I do see it. So let's get back to the questions. Which of the following entities recommends transmit receive channels and other parameters for auxiliary and repeater stations? Lauren, I'll get to your question in just a minute. So in a general area, you have what we call a frequency coordinator. And a frequency coordinator usually covers a region. We are in the Southeastern Repeater Association, what we call SARA. And it's a group of repeater owners that join it, and they meet to discuss new rules and things like that. But what the frequency coordinator does is when you get a repeater and you say, hey, you know what, CPN wants to put up some repeaters. We want to create a network, a 2-meter or 440 network throughout the Carolinas. And we want to connect all these repeaters together so that Michael in Columbia can effectively get on 2-meter and talk to Cowboy in Raleigh. What we would have to do is we would have to get with the frequency coordinator and him be able to tell us what frequency we want. First, we would tell him what frequency we want to use, and he would tell us that it's available. Now, in this area, we're a great, we've got a lot of open space. Frequency coordinators are not quite as critical as they would be in an area like New York City or LA, where, LA County has hundreds of repeaters, hundreds. You just go to repeaterbook.com, go to California, go down, and work your way down and look at the number of repeaters that LA County has. Some of these areas, a frequency coordinator is crucial, or you would just have so many people. You'd have repeaters constantly in conflict with each other. So the frequency coordinator recommends the channels and tones and offsets for auxiliary and repeater stations. They also resolve any conflict in assignments for repeaters in a particular region. So if 2 repeaters, for whatever reason, are conflicting with each other and are interfering, where you're hearing transmissions bleeding over into another repeater, they would go to the frequency coordinator to get that resolved. So with that said, let me go back to the chat. It says that, all right, Nathan, thank you so much for answering that. I think you're right too. If the screen gets blurry on you, it might be that your bandwidth is just slightly reducing itself, and it's causing a little bit of a lag. You know, these are still pictures, but you're in a real-time connection with me, so that very well could be the problem. Donna and Stephanie, I'm seeing your text, seeing your responses. Is it still happening to you? Is it persistent? Guys, just so you understand, there's about an 8-second delay, give or take. It's under 10 seconds delay between when you post and I see it. You know, and when you're hearing me talk, I said whatever I said 10 seconds ago. So there is just a little bit of a lag, not too much, but okay. So Donna said it's okay now. So that would kind of tell me that it's probably just a bandwidth issue. If you got kids in your house that are on their Xbox and a bunch of cell phones and everybody's using your Wi-Fi connection, you might want to try to reduce that while you're doing the webinar, just a little bit. Don't tell them to get off, but they just got to reduce it just a little bit. You know, a family of 5 or 6 using one Wi-Fi connection, it can, yeah, it can seriously degrade your connection. So, Donnie, you might have a ghost in your house sharing your connection, or you sure you didn't let a puppet or anything, or a dummy crash on your couch like the commercial? So a repeater, we will, Kelly, I'm going to get to what a repeater is. And you're right to ask that question. I just go in order the way these questions are, and you're right. It probably, a good definition of a repeater first probably should have come before all the technical stuff about the repeater. Basically, a repeater is what the name says it is. It enables you with your 5-watt Baofeng to talk 20, 30 miles. Whereas if you didn't have that repeater, you might only be able to talk a mile. It simply just repeats your signal out further from a higher elevation. So the repeater usually is not subjected to obstacles in the way like you as the radio operator are. Okay. So who selects a frequency coordinator? Well, I will tell you this, and the way that you can answer that, is that ham radio is a self-governing hobby. The FCC is there. They do manage our spectrum, the amount of frequency that we can have, but for the most part, the ham radio community polices itself. In other words, you're never going to get the FCC knock on your door for interference, because a ham radio operator will be the first to knock on your door. He's going to get a couple of his buddies. They're going to triangulate your signal, and they're going to knock on your door kindly, especially if they realize that you don't know that you're providing interference, and tell you. You know, when it says the FCC Office of Spectrum Management and Coordination Policy, there's no such thing. It doesn't exist. The local chapter of the Office of National Council of Independent Frequency Coordinators, that doesn't exist either. No such a thing. FCC Regional Field Office, now that might be a possible answer. However, just remember, in ham radio, we police ourselves. We keep each other in check. If somebody's on the air and they're cursing and using foul language, you're not going to see somebody from FCC come on the air and manage that person. It's going to be another ham radio operator that's going to remind him of the etiquette. Sometimes if you have interference and it's just occasional interference, you might get a postcard in the mail telling you about it. But more often than not, you just get a friendly knock at the door, and it'll just be another ham radio operator. And this is how that'll go sometimes. A guy will knock on the door and say, "Hey, man, my name is, my call sign is K4 CPR, and my name is, John Smith, And I just wanted to let you know that I've determined that there's some interference coming from your house. I'm pretty sure it's coming from your house. Would you like me to help you determine what it is? I'll be glad to help you. So you see, ham radio operators are so apt to want to help one another. We really don't leave each other stranded. It's just the nature of who we are. We're only strong, we're strong with each other and not separate. So you're rarely ever going to get a rude ham radio operator. It's in their best interest to help you mitigate whatever the interference is. So long story short, who selects the frequency coordinator? Amateur operators in a local or regional areas whose stations are eligible to be repeater stations. So again, Sarah is the Southeastern Repeater Association. And these guys right here, I know two of these guys that happen to be they happen to be repeater coordinators. They happen to own repeaters in the area. Two of them do. One of them, I don't know where he's from. And they decide among themselves who's going to be the leader, who's going to be the official frequency coordinator. But in general, they all collectively make the choices, and they all discuss. If a repeater wants to come online, they pass it around to the entire group and let them know about it. It's not, it's not a dictatorship with the Repeater Association. So with that said, what is the FCC Part 97 definition of an amateur station? Well, let's look at the answers here. Let's look at the bottom one. Any radio station for hobby use? That could be the case, but how about those that are in ARES, Amateur Radio Emergency Services, or RACES, Radio Amateur? What does RACES stand for? Anyways, how about those that are in emergency communications, and that's what they specialize in? And that's not really a hobby. That's a necessity. So that wouldn't be, I don't think you'd want a definition that just says that excludes emergency communication. So it wouldn't be hobby use. Operated by non-professional, any radio station operated by a non-professional. Okay, that's a possible answer, but you got guys that are ham radio operators, and they're in the radio industry. They work at radio stations. They're technicians. They work at radio shops that install, radios in fleet vehicles, police, ambulance, things like that. So, and they're professionals. You're taking a test right now. You're studying for the test. You're non-professional, but so that could possibly be the answer. A building where amateur radio receivers, transmitters, and RF power amplifiers are installed. How about your handheld and your Baofeng? As you're going down the road and going into, you go into food line with your Baofeng. Does the food line become a amateur station now? So the answer that makes, sometimes when you look at these multiple choice, you can eliminate some of them, and some of them could be the choice, and you're going for the best one, the one that most fully encompasses the question itself. So, definition of an amateur station. In the Part 97, it defines a station and amateur radio service consisting of the apparatus necessary for carrying on radio communications. So, essentially what an amateur station is, it's not a person, it's the radio itself. And I want to make that clear, because in studying for your test, there's a little bit of ambiguity that happens. And what I mean by that, there's a little bit of a blurred lines on what FCC considers some terminology. Times have changed, technology has changed. And I'll give you an instance. Some of these higher end radios, I can go to work, and through a web portal, I can control my radio at home and listen to it at work, listen to the traffic. And some of them have the interface where I can use my radio at home through the internet at work. And that's absolutely possible and legal. So the radio itself is the amateur radio, is the amateur station itself. And as you can see right here, all these are amateur stations. And this, you know, this gentleman here could have 3 or 4 of these radios going at the same time. And on his screens right here, you're seeing where he's got one of the radios he's controlling through a computer monitor. A lot of radios do that. Mine does that. Several people use, especially when they're doing digital HF, digital communications, where you're dealing with text on the screen. And I can tell that's what he's doing here just from experience. But nevertheless. And also in the back of this picture, do you see the postcards on the back wall? Those are QSL cards. Those are the souvenirs that this gentleman has collected over the years of his experience as a ham radio operator. And all those are from different countries. I see when it's probably Norway. And you can create QSL cards too if you like, you know, and put anything on them. Some people put their cat, they put their family, they put a picture of the radio station, or I've seen QSL cards that have nudity on them and have, you know, things that have nothing to do with radio. So anyways, that's a perfect example to show you what QSL cards are. When is willful interference to another amateur station permitted? I think this kind of goes to be a no-brainer. I don't think anybody is willing to accept interference that somebody is willfully injecting into the airwaves. Okay? So when you look at these, when is willful interference permitted? I don't know, when I'm doing a contest, do I want to have interference? A contest, by the way, is what the name says. It's a contest, but what it is a ham radio operator tries to make as many contacts within a certain time frame. At any one time, there's always a contest happening on the radio at all times. And if you become a member of ARRL, they will send you emails of what contests are happening. Because ARRL, the American Radio Relay League, is the body that encompasses ham radio. Kind of like if you want to teach firearms safety or find out about anything related to firearms, you most likely would go to the NRA. You don't want the interference during a contest, so that can't be the answer. At any time, amateurs are not protected from willful interference. Well, in a way, you are protected, because the rules state that when somebody is interfering with other stations, they are obligated to resolve that, or they can be reported, and if it continues, their station can be taken down by the FCC. It has happened. We've had a lady up in Greensboro a couple years ago. I'm not sure why she was doing it. I didn't get the whole backstory, but she had so many watts pumping through an antenna that she was interfering with TV stations in people's houses, radio stations, and what make it worse, she was interfering with the fire station that was closest to her. People had let her know about it, and she just totally ignored them and kicked her off her property. She wasn't able to kick the FCC off her property, and she wasn't able to kick off the $50,000 fine that the FCC took her to court for. I'll talk a little bit more about the enforcement later, but there's an enforcement officer that is retired now who makes his way around to all the clubs. His name is Riley Hollingsworth. He is a great guy. Great guy. And he says that don't worry about the FCC coming after you as a technician. just get on the air and practice. The more you practice, the better a radio operator you're going to be. And don't worry about making mistakes. The FCC is not going to come after you. When the FCC comes knocking on somebody's door, it's kind of like the game warden. They've been watching you for a while, and they've got a pretty solid case on you to where you should just shut up and put out your arms for the handcuffs. They have been watching you and racking up so much on you that the FCC has been known to plant monitoring devices down the street from an offender, or leave it in a car and leave the car parked in the same neighborhood as an offender and just collect that information and just collect it and collect it and collect it. And all that becomes part of a court case. So if you see an FCC officer at your door, you've been kindly told at least a few times and have brushed it off, and they got you. So only if the station being interfered with is expressing extreme religious or political views. Now that one could be very relevant in today's society. Boy, that really could be a possible answer. However, B, at no time is interference acceptable or is permitted. It does happen. It happens all the time. However, once you alert somebody, remember, they have an obligation. They are required to investigate and mitigate that interference. They're required to. So, I say never. So be very careful when you're testing your equipment into a dummy load. A dummy load can be a lot of things. It's a device. A dummy load can be a paint can full of oil, and it's got an antenna jack right in the center of the lid with a rod that goes down in the oil. And you screw a coax wire, you screw your antenna wire in it, and when you key up your radio, what it does is it makes the radio believe that the signal is going completely out the end of the coax, and none of that signal is being reflected back into the radio and causing heat and damage. So a dummy load is used most of the time for testing. Put in a new station, put it in a tower, an antenna. You screw into a dummy load, and you use that for testing. But when you screw into that dummy load, sometimes, especially if you're using a 100-watt radio, 100 watts going into a dummy load, as long as there's a wire connected to the back of it, no matter where it's going to transmit out that wire too. So it's possible that somebody at the other end of your neighborhood is going to hear you, or within a mile or two of you are going to hear your transmission. So when you're testing, be careful. Don't when you test with verbiage exactly as you would broadcasting, just in case you're getting out by accident. Which of the following is a permissible use of the amateur radio service? Broadcasting music and videos to friends is not allowed. You are not allowed to broadcast music over ham radio. There is one exception. We'll talk about it later. It is a question on the exam that it deals with that. But when you are talking to the International Space Station, and technicians are allowed to talk to the International Space Station and satellites, all amateur operators are allowed to. You just are only limited to the frequencies that you have privileges for. But if the satellite or International Space Station is tuned to that frequency, you certainly are welcome to broadcast to them. And a lot of times you can play Reveille or taps or something like that. That's allowed, and it's only allowed to be done to the International Space Station. So that can't be the answer. It's not permissible. Providing a way for amateur radio operators to earn additional income by using their stations to pass messages. Well, one of the rules with amateur radio is that you cannot use the radio for pecuniary purposes. You cannot use a radio in amateur radio. You cannot use amateur radio for financial gain. It's strictly voluntary. The people that work with emergency services to conduct communications when the grid is down, they're not getting paid to do that. Now they can get things like food and shelter. And I know in Katrina, some operators got free radios. They were donated by the manufacturers, and the manufacturers didn't want them back. So inherently, they got the radios. They got to keep the radios they were using. That happened to some, not a lot of folks, but it did happen. So you can't. So the first two answers are rules that are absolutely prohibited, not permissible. Providing low-cost communication to startup businesses. Again, you can't use amateur radio for financial gain, and you can't use it to run a business. A pizza delivery shop, Luigi's Pizza, can't use it to talk to his drivers. And, you know, a farm can't, well, a farm technically cannot use it to talk to the farm help. However, you can use frequencies if it's on simplex. I would say, how would anybody know? However, that still doesn't make it permissible. It just says that you would never get caught. So the only answer is allowing a person to conduct radio experiments and to communicate with other commercial radio services. I'm sorry. And you can't, I'm sorry, let me rewind for a second. You can't compete with commercial radio services or other entities. You know, Hot 105, Queen 93, whatever, they're in it for a profit, for advertising. You're an amateur radio service. You can't compete for airtime with them. You can't use the same spectrum that they are. It's completely for amateur, non-financial hobby use. And again, it can't be without financial gain. So simplex is radio to radio with nothing intermediary in between assisting in that signal. A repeater, some would argue that if you had a relay would not be simplex. But when amateur radio operators refer to simplex, they're usually talking about without the use of repeaters. So me hearing Judy trying to reach Lauren, if I'm in the middle and I can hear Judy but Lauren can't, me acting as a relay is still considered simplex. But it's also called a relay in that particular instance. But simplex is just without the assistance of any equipment to enhance or project your signal further. Hope that makes sense. Here goes that question when we were talking about with telemetry. What is the FCC Part 97 definition of telecommand? Well, when I think of telecommand, think of space command. Think of, when you see the word command, you would use a command in computers. You would use a command for your kids to initiate cleaning their room, modify their behavior, or stop what they're doing and terminate what they're doing. So in this particular instance, that's how I would relate the difference between what command and telemetry is. Correlate command with telling something you're going to initiate an action or a process, you're going to modify the way that it's working or it's behaving, or you're going to terminate it. You're going to terminate what it's currently doing. So when you think of telecommand, think of things like satellites. You know, it can't be for measuring distance from a measuring instrument. Telemetry is about measurement. Command is about initiate, modify, or terminate. Telecommand and instruction from VEC. Again, VEC is such a very minute audience that you're not taking a test about VEC or taking a test to become a VE, a volunteer examiner. So whenever you see anything referring to VEC as an answer, disregard it. It's outside the scope of what you're studying for. An instruction bulletin issued by the FCC. An instruction bulletin would be called a bulletin, period. It'd be a bulletin. And it wouldn't come over the airwaves. It'd be sent to you by email, or it'd be sent to you in snail mail. So telecommand, initiate, modify, terminate. Think of commanding your children to modify their behavior or terminate it. Understood? All right. And again, this would be an idea of telecommand, of sending a signal to something out of space to change its trajectory, to change the frequency that it's monitoring, or anything like that. What must you do if you are operating on the 23 centimeter band and learn what that you are interfering with a radio relocation station outside the U.S.? This question is really easy to get you confused. You're being thrown 23 centimeter. You're being thrown radio location station. These are things you've never heard of. But you know what? You don't need to hear about them, because all you need to concentrate on is the questioning is asking you about interference. And it goes back to what we said earlier. Interference is not allowed. You cannot interfere with another station transmitting. And when you find out that you're interfering, you're to stop operating immediately and take steps to mitigate and eliminate that harmful interference. The same, and that could be, stop operating the minute somebody knocks on your door, or the minute that you unkey and somebody comes in and says, "Hey, you were cutting into a net, you were stomping on somebody that was already talking." So, these other answers, we don't really have to go into them so much, because the one word that you've got a word in the question and you've got a word in the answer. Interference. And D does have interference in it as well. But think about it. Chances are if you're interfering, it doesn't matter how you're transmitting and causing interference. It doesn't matter if you're using voice or CW mode. CW is Morse code, by the way. It doesn't matter what mode you're using, you're interfering, and you're going to interfere no matter what mode you're using, because the transmission coming off of your radio is causing the interference. No one mode is going to eliminate interference than another. So, again, it always goes back to, when you got interference, stop operating immediately and do something about the interference, period. Work with the person that told you about the interference. They are experiencing it, so they would be able to tell you when it stopped and you've cured the problem. And they're going to almost always be willing to help you test and locate what the interference is. I'll tell you, one of the things as a technician, one of the things that you will run into that will interfere with your signal are these little wall adapters that you put into the wall. We call them wall warts. And the reason why is because they're so cheaply made, and they're made in such mass quantity that how many of you have had equipment in your house and the adapter burned out and you had to go get a new one? It burnt up or just stopped working. It's usually almost going to be the weakest point of a piece of equipment. Those wall warts tend to be the greatest interference. Flat panel TVs can also create a lot of interference, especially these 65, 70-inch ones can really wreak havoc. The 23 centimeter band, what is it used for? It's just another band that you have available to you as a technician, just like 2 meter. 2 meter would be like, 145, 150 megahertz, 440, 440 and two that would be in your Baofeng. Your Baofeng would be capable of transmitting on 440 and 2 meter. 23 centimeter, you really don't have to worry too much about 23 centimeter. It's up in the gigahertz range, 1.2, somewhere like 1.3. It is available to you to be able to use, but more often than not, 23 megahertz is going to be used for satellites. It's such a high frequency that you're going to see it more used for satellite use. So you won't experience too much 23 centimeter, but that's why I say with this question, don't overlook this question. Don't pay attention to it. The thing that should cue you in is the moment you see interference. That's what this question centers around, is the interference. And when is it acceptable? Well, you just saw a question that said at no time, never is interference acceptable. It doesn't matter what it's interfering with, it's not acceptable. What is the ITU? We saw this, it was a couple of the answers to it was in some of the answers to previous questions. Somebody had asked about these questions, will these same answers, that choices that you see, will they be the same choices you see on the test? Yes. That is the beauty, and that's why I don't understand sometimes why some folks will make the technician test much harder than it is. You will never, there will be rarely be a test in your life where you're given the question pool exactly as it's worded, each question, and the exact same choices for that question in the test. Now, if you have this what is ITU question in your test, B may not be the answer. A United Nations agency, it may be D. It isn't. They're not going to be in the same order. But when you see what is the ITU, one of the choices is it's going to be a department of the FCC, or these other three choices. They'll just be mixed up. So what is the ITU? It is International Telecommunications Union. It's a United Nations Agency of Information and Communication Technology. It's a consortium, a coalition, whatever name you want to use, but countries get together and they make rules according to, they can agree on changes that need to be made. Oftentimes, the United States usually takes center stage. United States and Europe tends to be at the forefront, but we really don't have the alpha seat when it comes to the ITU. But remember that the ITU, International Telecommunications Union, and the great way to remember that is that the answer, it says international. United Nations should cue you in on that. These other answers are referring to something within the United States. So that would be your cue on what the answer is. ITU, International Telecommunications, United Nations Agency. And the ITU is broken up into 3 regions. We happen to be in Region 2. Region 2, by region, the rules may vary very slightly within a region. So the rules for us are going to be quite similar to those in Cuba, in South America, Central America, Canada, but they can be more different than, say, those stations that are coming out of Africa and out of Asia and Europe. There's only 2 countries in the world that strictly prohibit any radio communications. It's going to be obviously North Korea, and I can't pronounce the word. Eritrea is the name of the country. I don't even know where that country's at, to be honest with you. But nevertheless, there are 3 regions to the ITU, and these regions have multiple representatives in each region that meet at the United Nations to discuss rules and cooperation and things like that. And every once in a while, you'll see a country like Cuba. Cuba, for instance. Cuba at one time didn't allow radio communications to come out of it. And in recent years, it's lightened up and it's slacked quite a bit, and they allow it. China's the same way. You won't see too many. China has very, very strict rules, but there are amateur radio stations that do come out of China. Why are the frequency assignments for some U.S. territories different from those in the United States? Well, here's the reason why. The United States is one thing. We may have rules here, but Guam is in Region 3. And Guam is a territory, is one of our U.S. territories. So they have to follow Region 3's ITU rules. So just because it's a territory of the United States doesn't necessarily mean that all of the rules for the United States are followed in that territory. Likewise, we have a lot of islands around the Caribbean that Britain owns. Britain's in Region 1. The British Virgin Islands are in Region 2. But the British Virgin Islands are a territory of Britain. So I think you guys get the idea there. Why are the frequency assignments for some U.S. territories different from those in the 50 states? Again, located in different regions. And when you look at these answers here, territorial governments are allowed to select their own frequency allocations. That's not true. They still have to follow, their rules have to fall under the collective rules of the region, the ITU region that they're in. If they're a member of the United Nations, if they're a member nation, they collectively cooperate with those bodies within the United Nations on all international matters. So that wouldn't be the right answer. Territorial frequency allocations must also include those of adjacent countries. Well, that's not true, because if we go back and we look at, the only time Region 1 and 3, they're adjacent to each other. But that must also include those adjacent countries. It's just simply not true. Not all countries are adjacent to each other. So, being butted up against each other isn't going to change whether or not it has no effect on radio privileges. Any territory that was in existence before the ratification of the Communication Acts of 1934 is exempt from FCC frequency regulations. Oops. So a question was asked, so ITU rules overrule national rules? That's a good question. They don't overrule national rules, and this is the way that you know it, because I told you that when we look over here and we look around North Korea, people in all that would mean that people in Australia would have to abide by the same rules that North Korea has. So no, and I don't mean to confuse you if I am, that ITU rules overrule national rules. However, territories themselves, when they're a territory of a country, they are not a sovereign nation of their own. And with that said, each nation is going to have their rule. The way they license are different. Not all countries have technician, general, and extra. Canada calls theirs a little bit different. They have a novice license. In Europe, they call theirs a little different. So I hope that helped. One of the reasons that it's important to know about the ITU zones is that different zones often have different frequency assignments. And that's really the biggest difference, is the frequency assignments. That and ITU also delegates what paperwork you must have. Reciprocity. I can't always remember that, say that word. Try to say it 10 times fast. But the 2-meter band for us is not always going to be the same as for Europe. And the reason why, when you think about that, is because, you know, every country has different systems that they use. For instance, in Britain has thousands and thousands of closed circuit cameras. Their level of national security is completely different than, say, United States or even Canada. So, you know, every country has systems to national defense, to emergency services, that in one country may not be of an interference, but in their country it is. So these different zones can have different frequency assignments. And within the zone, usually the ITU zone is going to agree more in common of the frequency allocations for that zone. So Dan was asking about, didn't the USA back in the 90s have a novice license as well? They did. And in fact, they used to have an advanced license. They didn't have an extra license. It was advanced. And when they did away with Morse code, they did around the same time, they did a lot of a realignment. And when they changed the testing requirements and what would be in the testing contents, they also restructured the licenses as well. So, and that's a point that is worth mentioning. So if a person, and about now, it's not an issue, but you got to remember licenses, I'm sorry, we'll get to the question, but licenses are good for 10 years. So after they made the changes, you know, I believe they made the changes, I want to say in 97, 98, it was in the late 90s. So it wasn't until the, 2008, 2007 that folks that had an advanced license or a novice license were beginning to expire. So what they did was, if your license, in order to get that license, you took your Morse code and passed your Morse code segment, you got bumped up a license grade. So if you were a novice and you took the Morse code and passed it, you are now a general. And if you were an advanced and you took Morse code, you would be an extra. My dad was one of those that was an advanced, and he never passed his, he never passed the Morse code segment. So he got knocked down to technician and had to go study for the general. Didn't have to do Morse code, but he had to study for the general. When his license expired for novice, he actually lost some privileges and came down to technician and had to study for the general. And then he actually gained more than he had within novice. So yes, at one point we had a different licensing structure. And other countries as well, they've changed theirs. Cowboy asks, when you talk to a different region, which rules apply? You have that, and that's a really good question, Cowboy. You follow the rules within your region where you're at. You need not worry about the rules of Iraq and the rules of China or anything like that. Because, and if you think about it, if you're sitting in Raleigh, North Carolina on your radio and you transmit and you happen to get somebody in North Korea, how's North Korea going to punish you or going to fine you? Or they're going to have to go after the person that responded to you. So the station where it originated from, where the signal originated from, has to follow the rules within the boundaries of where the signal originated from. And vice versa, whoever responds to you, they have to follow their rules. It's only when you go to that country that you have to follow their rules. And oftentimes you have to get you have to file for privileges ahead of time in order to be able to use your radio in that state, in that country. The only exception to that is if you are an extra class radio operator. If you're an extra class, there are a large number of stations that you can go to that country and not have to file any paperwork, and you can automatically start using the radio and use your call sign. It's kind of an interesting concept that when you go to use your call sign and you're on the radio, nobody knows where a signal is originating from. When I'm listening and I've got 20 stations that are overlapping each other and I'm trying to pick through them, I have no idea where those 20 stations are. And a majority of the time, if I pull out a call sign, I'm not going to go look it up to see what station it is until later. If I'm contesting, that would be important because I want to know all the countries I was able to reach. But typically in a normal conversation, I'm not going to look up the country until I go to log it in my logbook. And then electronic logbooks will tell you where that call sign originates from. And a lot of times when you get good at it, you know by the call sign where it comes from. So like in India, so in America, your call sign has to start with a W, a K, an N, or an A. Think a wank. W-A-N-K. Your call sign has to start with those. You'll rarely see a call sign that starts with an A. But W, N, and K are the most common. But if you go to India, a lot of their call signs start with V, as in Victor. And most of the time when you get a call sign assigned to you, when you pass your test, you don't get to decide what your call sign is. Your very first call sign will be generated by FCC, and they go in order. So in other words, if me, my wife, and my 4 kids go down and we take our license test, and we're the only ones in the room, and I come back and I'm KM4 ABC, my wife is going to be KM4 ABD, my son is going to be KB4 ABE, FG, according to the order whoever the VEC was that filed the paperwork. In the order that they filed it is in the order that the call signs come out at. So you understand that that's how those are assigned. It's not until you get an automatically generated call sign that you're able to request a generated call sign. And we're going to get into that in some other questions. We're about 20 questions deep, and we've got quite a few more to go, and I've got about 20 minutes left. So I'm not going to rush anymore. We're going to take this as we go. If you don't understand something, like some of you have been doing, please ask questions. I'm going to give you this question pool. If you don't have it already, I'm going to give it to you in an email when the class is done, so that you can follow along a little bit better on paper. But I'm not going to rush this any faster. So if we only get 30 done tonight, well, then we're just going to pick up on 31 next week. So with that said, okay, which frequency is within the 6 meter band? Now, I can just imagine if I could look into every one of your computer screens, I'm seeing shoulders hit earlobes. Oh, that's probably the most confusing thing as a new amateur radio operator on converting. And it'd be the most frustrating when people say, I'm on the 6 meter band. You're like, I don't know what frequency that is. I've got a great way for you to remember. And I told Cowboy about this when I met him this weekend, and even he was like, oh, wow. So here's how you do it. So what frequency is within the 6 meter band? Well, whenever they give you a frequency, divide it by 300. Or divide that number, divide 300 by that number, I'm sorry. Divide 300 by that number. So in this case, 300 divided by 6 comes out to 50 megahertz. Now, you could sit here and you could say, well, 49 is just as close to 50 as 52.525. And if you were experienced enough, you would know that 49 megahertz is not in the 6 meter band. But you don't know that quite yet, and that's absolutely okay. But just remember, when you're given a meter, given a band, subtract that band 300. Likewise, you can reverse that. So somebody said, what band is 52 megahertz on? Well, divide see if you guys see my Okay, it's not wanting to show my calculator. No problem. I was trying to put a calculator up to show you. But if you divide, likewise, 50 megahertz, and you divide into 300, you're going to get 6. And here you go. So remember I told you 49 megahertz isn't even in the band. And these other two, you can completely knock those out. This 28.50, that's going to be a 10 meter band. Why? Because I'm going to divide 28 into 300, and I'm going to get really close to 10 meter. However, keep in mind, this 300 trick doesn't work for all the bands. And what I mean by that is, it doesn't work on the band plan, and I'll show you in a minute here. However, you see this 300, you got 6 meter band, divided into 300, you get 50 megahertz, and vice versa. You're going to get approximately 2 to 3 questions on your test that are going to do this to you. And they're going to ask you what band these are on. And they keep it pretty simple for you. They don't go too hard for you. As a technician, you're going to be using 2 meter and 440. 440 is 70 centimeter. And you can't get, if I told you 70 centimeter, that's one of those bands that you're not able to use the 300 trick with. And that's why you don't really ever hear anybody refer to as 70 centimeter. The 440, you always just hear them say 2 meter 440. When you bought your Baofeng, go to Amazon.com and look up one of the Baofengs, look in the description, it'll say 2 meter 440. They don't ever say 70 centimeter. So anyways, which amateur band are you using when your station is transmitting on 146.52? Well, if I divide that into 300, I come in at around 20 meter. None of these other ones come close. So remember the number 300 to help you when you're trying to convert frequency to bands and band to frequency. If it was a 20 meter band, you would be around what? 14 megahertz, something like that. I went to private university, so I use my teeth and my toenails to count, so you'll have to excuse my preppy education, higher education. Again, but see, you go back to here, where if you divide, and you see these stay right in around 150. There's no other frequency, there's no other band that comes close to 150. Oops. And if you use that method over time, it'll greatly help you quickly adapt to what they're talking about. If I said I was on a 10-meter band, you would know that I'm around 30 megahertz. Which 70-centimeter frequency is authorized to a technician class holder in region 2? Don't worry about the region 2. Don't worry about when you see the question like what's the first thing your brain went to? Is 70-centimeter frequency. This is one of those that you're going to have to do your best to remember. I don't know. You're right, Dave. But this, you're going to have to just remember that 440 is the same as 70 centimeter. Now, when you see the band playing, you see this E, A, G, T. What that is extra, advanced, general, and technician. And they're just telling you that this is the plan that these class licenses can use. So you don't have to worry about that too much. Just explain to you if you see it. The difference between the red and the green, one is voice, and both of these are voice. But when you look at the band plan that ARL put out, where I took a snapshot of this at, the green is for one set of privileges, and the red is for another. I forgot which one it was, but they're the same thing. It's going to be voice. You will see on your test often a reference to phone, or phone is the same as voice. It goes back to the FCC is in some areas, in some instances, they're still stuck in the early ages of radio. We haven't used phone, an actual phone headset, forever. We get the idea they're saying microphone, but they're not telling you that in the test, microphone. So the term that they use is phone, and that can be quite, it can confuse a lot of people. When you see that, though, phone is referring to microphone, voice. Data will be data, and CW will be Morse code. Which 23 centimeter frequency is authorized to a technician class licensee? And in this one, you're gonna have to you would have to convert that 23 centimeters into meters. So a centimeter is what, 10? And when I divide 300 by 230, I come out to 1.304. And a lot of times 23 megahertz they refer to as 1.3 gigahertz. Here they're breaking it down into megahertz for you, but 1,000 megahertz is 1 gigahertz. 1,000 kilohertz is 1 megahertz. I do want to make a note here, and that is that because I'm teaching you this class, those of you that have heard me speak, I've told you specifically that just because I'm an extra class just means privileges. It doesn't mean I'm any smarter. Trust me when I tell you I'm as bright as a 5-watt bulb on a dimmer switch. Trust me. My wife will agree. However, when we take, you know what they say, those that can do and those that can't teach. There are some things that in ham radio that to me are so non-relevant that I haven't pried into the granular reason on the way they are. They just are, and I've just accepted it and memorized it and moved on. And you're going to have to do the same thing. You are just studying for the test. That's it. And when you study for this test and you use an app on your phone, you are going to see some questions and answers that you can't explain. You don't know why it is, and you're not necessarily going to be able to put it into a way that you can memorize it. You're just going to have to find a way to memorize it. Luckily, that's not a large majority of the test. That's a very small, minute part of the test that you have to do that with. Now, we've already hit about 4 or 5 of these, and I can tell you that you will probably only see 2 questions out of all these. You will only see about 2 questions on the exam. And I can tell you, being a VEC coordinator, that I've only ever seen the 2-meter question that they ask that we've already passed, and the 70-centimeter question. Those are the only 2 that I've seen on the test. I haven't, in this 223, I have seen a few times. Rarely have I ever seen it, though. This one here, I've never seen on a test. Never have. But it's good that you just memorize it. You could always be that exception. For the technician class, there's about 50 different versions of the test, at least 50. So it's, I haven't seen every single version for every single question. So now 220 megahertz, 220 is another one of those bands like 440. It is a band that does get used. It doesn't get used very often, and the reason why is because very few radios out there have 220 capability. Baofeng just came out with a model last year for the first time that was a tri-bander. It had 2-meter, 440, and 220. However, 220 just doesn't get used very often. It's a good band. It's a really nice band to have because it shares some of the characteristics of 440 and some of the characteristics of 2-meter. And what I mean by that is that 440 is better around rougher terrain and indoors, whereas 2-meter will go the distance without as much power. And 2-meter hugs right down the middle there and kind of gives you the best of both worlds. Unfortunately, very few radios have 220 capability. I see some of you are you're doing the math right, and I appreciate that. Don't be afraid to call me out. I'm human, and I really appreciate you showing me that. So just remember that 300 is your magic number when you're dealing with these megahertz and these bands, okay? If you do that, you'll be successful. Now, I want to point out something here. This 220 band is a perfect example of use it or lose it. At one time on 220, we went all the way. We had 219 all the way to 225, and the FCC found that we weren't using all the bands, so they took it away from us. And in the amount of time that they took it away from us, the Mississippi River has, Mississippi River is such a crucial shipping lane for the United States that it has its own digital network. It has its own, not digital, but it has its own network of communications. And when they built that network, they built it right in the 220 range. And that's the gap that you see that we could not get back. And that's why we're able to get 219 to 220. And then we have a gap there. And that is primarily because of Mississippi River network. Which of the following is a result of the fact that the amateur radio service is secondary in some portions of the 70 centimeter band? And that's 440. 440 has a lot of frequency available to it. When you take it down to, 2 decimal places, you've got almost 1,000 frequency allocations that you can get out of in the 440 band, 440 frequency. Over 1,000 frequencies, whereas on the 2 meter, you're getting it's much smaller. You're only getting a few hundred at best. So here it says, which is a result of the fact that the amateur service is secondary. It says U.S. amateurs must give foreign amateur stations priority. No, it's our band. We were given allocation to it by the FCC. Foreign stations can go pound sand when it comes to our frequency, and they would say the same to us about theirs. If you happen to be up in an area of like, northern New York, along the northern border of the United States, going into Canada, you're dealing with another country. There may be an instance where we have frequencies that bleed over a little. There is just a matter of cooperation. It's not a competition. It's gentleman's courtesy. If you arrive at a frequency and somebody's already on it, you move. You don't insist that you get that frequency. That's why you'll see sometimes, especially on our 80 meter net, we have 4 or 5 possible frequencies that we could be on. It's because if we get to one that night, Murphy's Law, somebody's on it. We moved in the next one. That one's got really bad interference. Nobody can hear you. We moved in the next one, and so on. So international communications are not permitted on 70 centimeter on 4. That's absolutely incorrect. If you can talk on 440, you can talk. Europe uses 440. You can talk to Europe if you can reach it with a large enough antenna, enough power. Digital transmissions are not permitted on 70 centimeter. That's false too. Every band in our frequency spectrum has a segment of it delegated to digital and Morse code. Every single one of them. But one of the things you ought to know is that, in the 440 range, we have some military aviation systems that use 440. And obviously, our military is going to take priority over amateur bands. Now, the military doesn't have primary frequencies that are in the 440 range, but the military has several layers of backup systems, and their backup systems, some of their systems are using 440 in case the more primary systems go down. And in that case, if you do run across it and it happens, it tends to be happening, you immediately cease your operation and let the military have it, period. Military takes first. Matters national defense. Why should you not set your transmit frequency to be exactly at the edge of an amateur band or sub band? Well, all of these are correct, because even though my radio says 145 megahertz, if I like to go four-wheeling and doing wheelies in my truck, my radio can very well get knocked out of whack than yours that sits on a desktop. And it might be just very little bit, but it can happen. You see a lot of that on HF especially in Morse code, where Morse code uses such a very narrow signal that it's very crucial that you both find the same frequency. And one person might be .52, another person might be .53 on their radio. And it doesn't matter that it's different, but that it reads different on the radio, as long as it's transmitting in the same frequency. In those cases, a lot of times, if you're aware of that, you obviously want to go get your radio looked at and get it calibrated. But the main reason why we don't ride the edge of our bands is because our voice has sidebands to it, has a modulation to it. And as you get louder and as your voice pitch changes, that wavelength gets wider and shorter. So you have to give it room to move. And again, the transmitter frequency can drift. And it can often drift in times of extreme temperature. So if a radio's been operating for hours and hours and hours and it is just hot, I mean, it is burning up, it can cause the components inside to shift. And in return, that can cause your frequency to drift very minorly. Again, in voice, it might just be a matter of somebody not coming in quite as clear as they potentially could, but you will hear it in digital. You will hear it a lot more in digital and in Morse code, where you really want to be on the same frequency with each other. So you wouldn't sit on the roof with your legs dangling off the edge, would you? Now, I know some of you say, oh, sure, man, I do it all the time. Okay. But for the most of us that are safety conscious, have a conscience of being safety, I think we'd rather be a little bit more towards the inside of the roof. Same kind of concept. You know, you want to remain a little bit more within the bands to make sure you don't drift outside of it. Some of our bands right on the very edge starts other services. And you don't want to interfere into those because it goes back to willful interference. And here's what I was talking about. We're going to wrap it up here in just a second. We'll get down to, how about if we finish the B section? I think I got about 3 more, and then we'll call it for tonight. So the question was, can you listen in a military transmission on the 440 band? Absolutely. You can listen to, you are free to listen to anything that you can hear. And that's a very interesting point, and that is that always be mindful that when you're talking on the radio, that everybody can hear you. There's nothing private. There are no rules that say that when you hear something, you have to change the station or you have to change the frequency. If they want their conversation to be so private, go digital. They should be doing digital, or they should be using a closed circuit. So, you know, I get your point in that is that military transmissions, are you going to hear any top secrets or anything? Trust me. The military is not going to pass confidential and top secret information over an unencrypted frequency so close to the amateur bands. So going back to this question, right in the middle is where the base of your signal would be. And you have lower sideband, you have upper sideband. Don't worry so much about the term lower and upper sideband. That becomes a little bit more common in HF frequencies, but in 2 meter and in the technician class frequencies, you can and are able to do digital communications. The same communications that I do on HF, I can do on 2 meter. However, I have to do them within the allocated frequency that is in the band plan for digital. But I will say that if you happen to do digital over voice in the voice area, you probably aren't going to get a knock at the door, but you can't go knock on somebody's door and say, hey, I'm transmitting on the voice side of this frequency, and your talking is interfering with my digital. Because they're in the right place, you're not. So there's not so much enforcement if you go, you know, if you're on the voice section of a band, just anticipate that if you are, you can greatly anticipate that you are going to hit some interference. And the reason why is digital signals are very narrow and voice is very wide. So the reason why I put this diagram here is to show you potentially how wide you have to give for a margin on the left and the right side, the upper and lower side of a signal for that frequency wavelength to jump and still stay within the band. So imagine rolling down the highway and, a highway lane is probably 12 feet across and you got one of those little smart cars, those little beep type cars. Probably two of your cars side by side could fit in that one lane. But it's still advisable when you're driving down the highway to stay in the middle of the lane and don't ride the line. So, because you probably won't hit somebody else's car, but your mirrors are going to hit because your tire might be on the line, but your mirror is going to be over the line. Does that make sense to everybody? Kind of take that example and carry that over into voice transmission. The base of your signal is going to be your tires, but the outside edge of your voice could be the mirror that overrides into somebody else's lane. Which of the bands above 30 megahertz that are available to technician class operators have mode restricted subbands? And what they're getting at here is that the term mode restricted subband means that no handheld or mobile FM voice transmissions can happen here. And mode restricted subband typically refers to CW. Now I will tell you that you are more likely to get in trouble for using voice in the digital area than you are using digital in the voice area. Because you see right here on 6 meters, they're only given 0.1, 1/10 of a megahertz to be able to operate. You would be, if you were using voice, you would be using willful interference. Whereas it's potentially possible that you could do digital in the voice area, just find an area for it, and nobody's really going to jump on you for doing that, but just understand that you're probably going to be susceptible to interference. Same with 2 meter, and the same with 220. So somebody says, we used to encrypt our UHF transmissions when needed. That you're right. The military still is going to encrypt on 440, but because it's a backup system, you're rarely ever going to hear it. And when you do, a lot of times if you're near a base, near a major installation, a lot of times you can hear 440 transmissions coming out of that base if you're close enough to them, but they're not going to be talking of anything sensitive. If it's a backup system that they use for operations, at that point, more often than not, they're going to encrypt it, and you're going to hear it's just going to sound like a fax machine more than anything. Somebody says, how many kilohertz are in the sidebands typically, or does it depend on the carrier frequency? No, it doesn't. So I believe it's 3 kilohertz. I believe it's 3 kilohertz on each side is your typical voice. I believe. I have to research that. It's been a while since I've been asked that question. But I'm going to get copies of this chat afterwards. And for the things that I'm unsure will be the first things that we hit next week. And so it gives me a blueprint to be able to investigate further. So I'm going to investigate that. But Dave, I believe that it's 3 kilohertz on each side. It's either 3 or 6. It's not very much, but it's enough that if you ride your carrier signal on the band edge, you're going to be out of the frequency range and be violating the spectrum. Okay, we're almost done here. What emission modes are permitted in the mode restricted subbands at 50 to 50.1 and 144.0 and 144.1? It's going to be CW only. And again, it comes back to, because CW can get through almost any, it can get through most interference. Atmospheric interference it can get through. However, voice, especially voice that's within range of the transmitting station, it is so easy for voice to bleed over and just completely drown out a CW signal. Oftentimes the CW signal will still get through even then, but what will happen is the station on the other end can't hear the transmission because it sounds like the teacher that you heard on the Peanuts. Wah, 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 wah. That's what it sounds like when somebody's bleeding over into your frequency. And that would be the case with CW. Can you imagine trying to listen to dits and das when you have wah 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 coming over top of it? So they've made mode restricted and isolated solely for CW. CW stands for Morse code. Plain and simple, Morse code. In the test, they rarely refer to Morse code in verbiage. They almost always are going to say CW. I'm going to research on what CW means. Continuous wave. That's right. Sorry, continuous wave is what CW means. And what about RTTY and SSB? So SSB is single sideband. So I'm going to go back here. This is when you're doing long distance communications. When you see a typical full voice signal, it doesn't appear to be a lot of frequency, but voice does take up a lot of bandwidth. In order to get a full signal, what a lot of ham radio operators will do is they will transmit in single sideband. And what that does is it eliminates, let's see, when you're just talking on this side, ooh, okay. This right here, when you're just talking on this side of the frequency, sometimes you will hear interference if you are using both sides of the band of the carrier. Sometimes if you just use one side of the carrier, you can eliminate that interference that's coming in. You can reduce it. I won't say eliminate it, but reduce it in such a way that it doesn't dominate your signal. Most radios have filters in them that you can adjust the filter to move the sensitivity over to one side of the band that you're on. However, when you get up into HF, typically lower sideband is going to be digital and voice is going to be upper sideband. More often than not, if you're going to talk to somebody and you want to talk to them with PSK31, and we'll get into all that in a couple of weeks. We'll get into digital communications, and I think you'll find that stuff pretty interesting. If those have heard me talk, and I talked about sending emails over ham radio, that's digital communications. Typically, lower sideband is going to be for that digital, and upper sideband is going to be for the voice. and that's to get out further. If you're going to use both sides of the band, full FM spectrum or AM spectrum, and you can expect not to get quite as far. Why are frequency assignments? I think I got about two more questions. And then I think I get up to 14, and then we'll cut it from here. And Dan, thank you so much. RTTY is radio teletype. It does still get used. It requires a really heavy load on radios to use RTTY. We call it RTTY, RTTY. Slang is RTTY, we call it. It doesn't get used a whole lot because we've had so many more newer digital modes come about. But radio teletype was used when I told you about the American Red Cross getting military telegrams and things like that. RTTY was the choice of mode that they used to be able to do that. Again, and unfortunately, RTTY causes a lot of load on radio equipment. The older equipment that used tubes, the little glowing glass tubes, they thrived on heat. You could get those things as hot as and they loved it, like a diesel engine. They loved heat and they thrived on it. However, when you start getting into these newer radios that have digital signal processing and that have far more sensitive parts in them, heat is a bad thing. You don't want to work a radio too hard, especially these radios that got touch screens and spectrum analyzers in them and stuff like that. So RTTY is kind of fallen. It still gets used, but it's kind of taken a back seat to some newer digital modes as technology has advanced and given us newer methods to communicate. So why are frequency assignments for the U.S. stations operating maritime mobile not the same everywhere in the world? So real quick, if we go through these, we know that the very last one is wrong. It says amateur frequency assignments are different in each of the 90 ITU zones. Remember how many zones there were? There are only 3. You are in zone 2. Frequency assignments are determined by the captain of the vessel. Wrong. The captain can only tell you if, when you're on a vessel and you are out at sea, you have to gain the permission of the captain in order to use a radio on his vessel. Why? Because he's going to want to know what frequencies you're going to use so that you don't interfere with his equipment, his onboard communications equipment. Also, he's going to tell you what flag of country he flies under. You may not have the privileges, and you have not gained permission from the country that ship flies a flag for. Because remember, when a ship is at sea, whatever flag is on the stern, it basically is a floating representation of that country's flag, the flag that you find on the app of the boat. John, yes, that's why I'm hurrying up here. We've only got about 2 more, and then we're shutting down. But when we're over this and I get done and I close out my end, it will compile the whole session we had tonight, and it will email you a link that you can go to for the replay. All the information here, this T1B12, that is an actual question number in the pool. So I am actually going over the questions that are in the pool that 35 potential questions could be pulled from. So I hope that answers your question. I totally understand the sensory overload. You're welcome to go if you want. I literally only have a few more to go. It is a lot of data. I understand. to consume. So maritime mobile, not the same everywhere in the world. Basically, amateur frequency assignments can vary among the 3 regions, and depending on what boat where it's located, you're going to fall under that region. While you're on the boat, whatever flag is flying, if it's an American flag on that boat, you're going to use your privileges, you're going to use your call sign, and you're going to transmit following the rules of the U.S., but you're going to have to follow the frequency allocations for the zone that boat's in. I know that's really confusing. Let me move on here. And the reason why also that regions matter is because the regions cover the bodies of water as well, not just the land, but they cover the bodies of water. So you have to take that in consideration, just like you would as if you were on land. Which emission may be used between 219 and 220 megahertz? And that's data. And that's where I was telling you that this portion in the middle, we lost all of it. We gained back 219 to 220, but what we didn't gain back was 220 to 222, and that's because the Mississippi River network, and because it's a vital frequency, a vital communication. So, and some of these you're just going to have to memorize, okay? I don't really have a way for you to be able to memorize it other than like that one there. There's really nothing that you have. I can tell you that fast scan television, you will never, as a technician, it's out of the scope of what you're studying for. It's just not there. Spread spectrum as well. The only 2 choices that you could possibly be dealing with is single sideband voice and data. And John, I know you're not, for everybody, you're not going to retain all this. When I give you the question pool at the, I have a couple documents that I'm going to give you, and one of them is called a no-nonsense study guide. And the way it is it reads out like a book. You literally read it like a book. And when you get it and you see it, you'll understand what I'm saying. It's in the file section of this webinar, and I don't know why you guys are not seeing the file sharing section. So anyways, okay, let's move on. We're almost done here. I think one more. Okay, we're done, folks. I told you we were down to the last few. I'm going to cut it here, and next Tuesday you're going to get an email. And unfortunately, each week you're going to have to register for this class. I'm sorry, but I can set this class to reoccur, and that's what I'm going to try to do. But it's was the first one, and I wanted to keep it simple and stupid for the very first one. So going forward, I'm going to try to set one up that you remain scheduled for, and you just get reminders with the link to the webinar. So I'm hoping that you won't have to do it again. However, just bear with me, and one more time, you're going to have to register for next week's session. When I close this out, you will get an email with a link that takes you to the replay of this, that it doesn't expire. You can use it whenever you want. And with that said, I'm going to send you the question pool. Again, I put it in file sharing. I thought that you would be able to get to it. Obviously, you can't. And I thought that would save me from having to send 60 emails. My email server only allows 20 at a time, and I just say, I think you get the point. Let you guys go. Great work, everyone. I want you to stay motivated. I want you to stay. So now you guys get to see me really quick. You get to see what my face looks like. You haven't probably, some of you haven't met me. I want you to stay motivated. I want you to stay encouraged, and do not get frustrated. And again, I'm going to send you the study guides and everything by email as an attachment. So please look forward to that, and then look forward to the email for the replay. In a couple of days, you should get another email about registration for future webinars. And I'm going to try to only make you do that one more time, and then you're registered for the duration of the class. With that said, it's been an honor and a pleasure to work with you guys this week, and I'm very proud of you for attending, and I hope to see you next week. Somebody's asking, can I put the files on the forum? I can. If you go to the CPN main page and you go to the files section in there, these files that I'm sending you are already there and have been there for a while. No nonsense guide. There's the band plan, the ARL band plan, and then there is the question pool. All of those have been in the file section on the Facebook page, main CPN page. But I will put them on the forum as well. Look for them in emergency communications section of the forum. Yeah, mugshot, I got you. Yeah, I'll leave that one alone. With that said, guys, I'm going to let you go, get some sleep, and thank you so much, and we'll see you next week. God bless everyone.